Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you may be. I'd like to thank KOSTI for inviting me to be a part of its outreach to its member companies. In this presentation, I will focus on two issues. First, the supply chain review ordered by Biden administration and the options it is likely to choose to close the gaps and vulnerabilities that these reviews will reveal. Second, I will be talking about the growing US concern about some states and non-state actors attempting to divert, access, and steal technologies from the US and its allies and its partners. In this case too, I will discuss the tools already in use by the US government and how they're likely to be strengthened and modified to respond to these concerns. Now, the supply chain issue has become more prominent in recent years because of several developments. First, the US workforce is concentrated at the extremes in skills development and earnings. At the higher end are people who are engaged in cutting-edge research, innovation, and design. At the other end are people who are unskilled and semi-skilled and are part of the services sector. The middle class, which traditionally drew its strength and income from skilled and semi-skilled manufacturing jobs, has been squeezed. Second, due to the distribution models, such as just-in-time inventory and assembly, glitches in supply chain of any commodity, whether it's food or medicines or components of products in computers, cars, plastics, chemicals, whatever, have long-lasting shortages and price hikes. The lack of PPEs during initial months of COVID are a good example. The longer the supply chains where sources are located across continents, the greater the risk of such disruptions. Finally, there is the leadership issue. In the US, many policymakers and analysts are concerned that if US remains dependent upon foreign suppliers for key components, especially in defense and advanced or dual-use technologies, its continued military and economic leadership position in the world will be severely affected. And if the supply chain involves hostile countries, US access to certain commodities can be held hostage by such suppliers. These are the four sectors of most concern for the Biden administration. You can see here, it's semiconductor manufacturing and advanced packaging, critical minerals, including rare earth elements, high-capacity batteries, and pharmaceutical and active pharmaceutical ingredients. However, one should note that this concern is not exclusive to the Biden administration. Several previous presidents took note of the same sectors and have attempted to understand the supply chains and have tried to dominate these in different ways. Trump administration's tariff hikes against Chinese products and sanctions against a growing list of Chinese companies was a crude attempt at trying to punish China. But it is interesting to note that even the Biden administration has not removed all the Trump-era restrictions. In fact, as the second segment of this presentation will show, Biden administration is trying to refine the punishing tools created by Trump administration and expanding their ability to identify and remove Chinese and some Russian entities from US supply chains. So there is emerging consensus across both major US political parties on several issues. First is that leadership in these areas, especially as they relate to emerging technologies of concern, will determine US global economic and military status in the coming decades. And the technologies of concern here are things like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, etc. Second, US and allies' technology, data, and intellectual property are being harvested by certain hostile countries for both military and commercial gains. The third point of agreement is that supplies of essential materials for these four industries should be secured against disruptions, whether they are natural or man-made. Now, among the natural ones, we include infrastructure bottlenecks, regional conflicts, or natural disasters. Among the man-made disasters, some analysts would include deliberate or accidental release of viruses, maritime conflict, civil wars, and invasion of Taiwan. So let's look at the semiconductor industry. Semiconductors are the world's fourth most traded product. They are behind only crude oil, refined oil, and cars. Many suppliers of key materials in this industry, such as silicon wafers, photoresist, and other specialty chemicals, are concentrated in China and East Asia. This is also the region where 75% of semiconductor manufacturing capacity exists. Moreover, all of the world's most advanced semiconductor manufacturing capacity in nodes below 10 nanometers currently resides in South Korea, 8%, and Taiwan, 92%. Now, the US still holds dominant positions, notably in chip design and electronic software tools. From the Netherlands, we have ASML Holding, which has a monopoly on the machines needed to fabricate the best chips. Japan is a key supplier of equipment, chemicals, and wafers. But as the emphasis shifts to even smaller, more powerful chips that require less energy, TSMC of Taiwan is increasingly in a field of its own, and it has helped Taiwan form a comprehensive ecosystem around it. For instance, ASE Technology Holding is the world's top chip assembler, while MediaTek, another Taiwanese company, has become the largest smartphone chipset vendor. Some analysts would say that Taiwan's grip on the semiconductor business, despite being under constant threat of invasion by Beijing, also represents a choke point in the global supply chain, which is inducing Tokyo, Washington, and Beijing to try to increase self-reliance. China has long tapped the island for chip-making talent. For instance, two key executives at China's top chip maker, Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation, or SMIC, used to work at TSMC. Taiwanese security firm Team T5 has observed a steady increase in attacks on the island's chip industry, corresponding to the tightening of US export controls in China. So the great worry is that TSMC's chip factories could become collateral damage if China were to make good on threats to invade Taiwan if it moves towards independence. So a two-pronged strategy is being used. First, develop domestic production capacity by investing in US industry, and second, encouraging Taiwan and South Korea and others to establish manufacturing plants in the US. Let's look at the high-capacity batteries. Lithium is an essential material in the production of lithium-ion batteries, which power electric vehicles. The global value chain for lithium includes global sources of mining, refining, and value added for the key lithium-ion battery materials. Results of a recent study show that only a few countries have economically viable resources of upstream raw materials in the lithium global value chain. Most lithium-rich ores are exported from Australia to China for processing, while most lithium brine concentrates are exported from Chile to South Korea, Japan, and China for processing. These large inflows of lithium to China support its dominant position in the downstream refining process, which is where the largest share of value addition occurs. Consequently, China is capturing the largest share of value-added materials along the lithium global value chain, even though it does not have indigenous sources of raw materials. The main point of controversy in this sector is whether the US should better leverage its quote-unquote sizable lithium reserves and manufacturing know-how. It should expand domestic battery production and reduce its dependence on China. Although abundant, lithium is hard to extract and process, and it also has environmental consequences if not regulated well. Expanding battery production in the US was a rare area where both parties agreed during the Trump administration, when a list of critical materials was established, along with the criteria under which battery mineral companies would become eligible for Energy Department loans. There was an EO 14017, which continues that focus and calls for a review of the state of domestic supplies of batteries and key battery minerals. However, Ganfeng and CATL, the two largest Chinese companies, have established long-term contracts and relationships with European and East Asian allies. Therefore, it appears unlikely that the US will attempt to use export controls or investment controls as tools to isolate these companies. The focus here will be on building US domestic supply. The rare earths sector is quite interesting. In 2018, the US Department of the Interior published a list of 36 mineral commodities considered critical to the economic and national security of the United States. 17 of these critical minerals are collectively called rare earth elements, REEs. So these 17 metallic elements are an essential part of many high-tech devices. They are a crucial component of more than 200 products, especially high-tech consumer products such as telephones, mobile hard drives, electric and hybrid vehicles, and flat-screen monitors and televisions. Similarly, on the defense side, REs are used in electronic displays, guidance systems, lasers, radars, and sonar systems. So one set of experts argue that REEs are not really rare because vast amounts of their deposits exist across many countries. So in an emergency situation, the US and its allies would make the necessary investment and create alternate supplies of REEs. The US is more likely to focus on building domestic capacity in this field. However, it's also building partnerships with countries similarly concerned by their overdependence on China. So Australia, India, Japan, who are considered part of the Quad with the US, are exploring cooperation. Some experts are also saying that consortium should be formed with allies and dependable partners to stockpile or develop rare earth material sources and also develop foreign, which is third-party sources of rare earth elements. Meanwhile, the other set of experts argue that if China does decide to weaponize REEs, the US firms and consumers would have to bear the cost. The key issue is that the refining and processing of facilities predominantly exists in China, giving it a huge strategic advantage. So by far the cheapest and fastest way to bring more material into the market would be to activate the Mountain Pass mine in California. But there is a more fundamental geo-economic dilemma the US government and firms face. The actual volume of REEs demanded by the global economy is relatively small. This market is already captured by a handful of Chinese players, making it hard for smaller players to survive. So over the long run, entering REE mining is not a profitable venture. So high national security concerns and low profits in the REE sector mean that only governments can influence the outcome in a positive way. In turn, this means that if countries such as the US want to effectively challenge the Chinese REE monopoly by entering the mining process, they would need to absorb the losses associated with such a move. For the pharmaceutical and biotechnology industry, many of the existing concerns in the US got amplified during the COVID-19 pandemic, when the demand surged but supply was disrupted due to factory closures and shipping delays. The Food and Drug Administration estimates that 80% of the manufacturers that produce ingredients for drugs are located outside the United States, many in China and India. So in May 2020, Executive Order 13922 gave the Chief Executive Officer of the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation new powers to help domestic manufacturers. by making loans, making provisions for purchases and commitments to purchase, and take additional actions to create, maintain, protect, expand, and restore domestic industrial base capabilities. In August 2020, President Trump followed this by signing Executive Order 13944, which directs agencies to maximize domestic production in procurement, identify vulnerabilities in the supply chains, and streamline regulatory requirements. Meanwhile, the US Congress has become very active in this field, and due to the visible impact of COVID on the pharmaceutical supply chains originating in Asia, especially from China. So one proposed law requires Secretary of Defense to develop a confidential list of critical drugs, provides $5 billion for investments in domestic production, and requires drug makers to report the source of their materials to the FDA. Another proposed law requires Federal Trade Commission and the US Treasury to conduct a study through CFIUS and provide assessments of the effect of foreign investments in the pharmaceutical industry of US. First, how will it affect domestic capacity to produce drugs and active and inactive ingredients of drugs? And how will it affect the domestic production of other products, such as for sequencing or storage of DNA, including genome and exome analysis? Biden administration's Buy American emphasis will support these congressional initiatives, which are aimed at reshoring critical industries and supply chains. For now, offensive measures against external suppliers are unlikely in this sector. Defensive measures, such as domestic capacity building, will be prominent, but on the lower end of the pharma products, that is, drugs, PPE, and API. But there is a high-tech side to the related biotechnology sector. US biotechnology sector has faced other threats, including the growing espionage and intellectual property theft by foreign actors, especially those linked to China. US Department of Justice has a China initiative, and it has uncovered numerous cases where US biotechnology researchers and biotech firms have been top targets for cyber theft and intrusion. Many synthetic biology products and genetic materials are already subject to US export controls, but gaps remain. There will be a sustained push on US partners and allies in the coming years to enhance their own export controls on dual-use biotechnology, to dramatically reduce the risk of facing sophisticated bioweapons in the hands of hostile actors in the future. So these are three US strategies that we can see in each of these sectors. US analysts believe that in the semiconductors, the dominance of Korean and Taiwanese companies is a result of two factors: supportive government policies and access to skilled labor force. So US government should also do the same. It must incentivize US industry to invest in domestic wafer fabrication or in making tools and equipment required in the fabrication or the semi-cap sector. So there is a $2 trillion economic stimulus package. And within that, there is almost $50 billion that is earmarked for semiconductor manufacturing and research. Moreover, there was an act passed by the Congress in December 2020 as part of the National Defense Authorization Act for 2021. It's called Creating Helpful Incentives to Produce Semiconductors for America. CHIPS, CHIPS, CHIPS for America Act. It aims to provide incentives to enable advanced research and development and to secure the supply chain. At the same time, US wants to encourage both foreign and US semiconductor manufacturers to expand their manufacturing capacity in the US. This would reduce dependence on manufacturing in geopolitically sensitive areas such as Taiwan, and it will also create high-paying engineering jobs in the US itself. In other sectors, US hopes to cooperate with allies to identify and develop alternative supply chains and build redundancy into supply chains by diversifying resources. So several implications are clear. First, the supply chain of critical goods might be overly reliant on one or two major suppliers, whether domestically or internationally, and these would be considered single point of failure. Second, the lack of domestic capacity to manufacture these critical goods and materials creates strong vulnerabilities for US security and US economy. So the third part is that US industrial base should be able to prepare against the growing numbers and new types of risks and contingencies, including climate, environmental, geopolitical, human rights, and forced labor type of situations. Fourth, vulnerabilities in digital products must be identified and countermeasures must be applied, for instance, by excluding products from China and Russia. Fifth, vulnerability of civilian supply chains that are dependent on competitor nations must be eliminated. Vulnerability of exclusive and dominant supply chains of critical goods and materials that are located in, or if they go through countries that are likely to become unfriendly or unstable due to actions of China or Russia or due to civil unrest, need to be considered as points of failure as well. So, partners and allies are expected to play a role in each of the three strategies in reshoring, in nearshoring, and in the development of indigenous capabilities in the US. Now, looking at the positive strategies of developing capabilities, finding alternate suppliers, and working with allies and partners, those strategies we discussed in the previous slide. There are also some other kinds of strategies that the US has been using already, and these are likely to get strengthened over time. There are trade security measures, and under this we have entities lists that most of you may be familiar with. There is also the military end users list that are part of that target end users, especially in China. We've also seen the United States use investment screening as a way of excluding certain companies from the US market. And CFIUS and FIRMA regulations, which screen investment into US, have been used effectively for that purpose. Then there is this growing interest about investment in securities by US persons or organizations. So if they are investing in securities, Chinese securities, new regulations have been introduced. And this is going to cause an elimination of US investments in Chinese entities. On the sanction side, we have the specially designated nationals list. We also have a newly created CMIC list, Chinese Military Industrial Complex list. Now, what you will see here, all of these, and then there are industry standards that are going to be developed, especially on cybersecurity. So what you're seeing here is that many Chinese companies have been put on entities lists, such as the largest foundry SMIC in China was put on entities list in December 2020. US companies are also restricted from exporting certain technologies to it. Since the US supplies almost 80% of SMIC equipment, it has significantly affected SMIC's operations. The US has even persuaded Netherlands to stop the sale of extreme ultraviolet EUV machine from ASML to SMIC, although it appears that ASML has agreed to supply lower specification machines to SMIC in 2021. ASML is the only manufacturer of EUV machines needed to make the most cutting-edge chips. In the high-capacity batteries, given the lack of processing capabilities at home and acute dependence on Chinese sources, US use of export controls and designation of entities is unlikely. The actions against Huawei, with over 150 of its affiliates placed on the entities list, have been reinforced by a broad requirement that expands CFIUS jurisdiction to review deals where they include items under US export controls. So now, if a deal includes critical technology that requires US license for export, re-export, or even in-country transfer or retransfer of such technology to certain countries, parties, or foreign persons, anywhere in the ownership chain, the US company would need to file a declaration because CFIUS review is now mandatory for all such deals. In cases of partnership between Chinese and US company, the review by CFIUS would focus on ultimate ownership structure, the scope of the partnership, and measures to address key data privacy concerns. On the risk of diversion of biotechnology to China, we are likely to see increased concern. There will be partnerships of US allies with Chinese academic institutions or with private sector entities, as well as joint technology programs. They will all come under US scrutiny to find out if US biotechnology should be exported to such allies, or if US should allow its companies to source materials or establish partnerships with entities in allied countries. On the issue of strategic trade controls, there is a focus on intangible technology transfers and military end uses. On sanctions, they may be sectoral or targeted. They may focus on, as increasingly it is, on information and communication technology sector, on human rights issues, and military end uses. The investment screening, beneficial ownership will become an issue. And cybersecurity and digital security standards are going to be developed to ensure that there is no foreign intrusion into the products being bought by US government or its contractors. So the key implication for US allies and partners. In the past, Asia handled most semiconductor manufacturing while advanced chip designs took place in Europe and the US. But now the US is planning to have more of the chip ecosystem onshore, including high-end equipment and materials. So this is likely to create a structural shift in the semiconductor supply chain. For the countries considered US allies and partners, it will be important to show that they also have identified and prioritized the critical as well as essential goods and materials in similar ways. The high-tech companies of US allies are likely to establish facilities in the US as a business decision to ensure their preeminent position as a major supplier of critical goods to the US defense and civilian industry. So the expectation from partners and allied governments will be that in these situations, they will encourage or at least not discourage such moves by their own companies. There will be sustained efforts by the US, diplomatic, economic, security, trade policy, to encourage allied countries to participate in initiatives designed to strengthen supply chains, which are of mutual interest, and to minimize supply chains that are vulnerable to manipulation and pressure by China. These initiatives will include reform to international trade rules and agreements. So what we are likely to see are tightening controls on future Chinese investments and greater scrutiny of existing Chinese investments. It also means that an investment ban is unlikely in the near future. But what we are likely to see is concentrated US attempt to squeeze Chinese firms out of the US market. The key takeaway is that the seeming US techno-nationalism and this move towards technology autonomy developing everything at home, is going to be tempered by the realization that global supply chains cannot be erased, especially those that have been established over more than a decade. But the US will increasingly require partners and allies to play a crucial role in making supply chains more resilient. In this, US will be focused on distinguishing between those who share US vision of threats and vulnerabilities and those who don't. And only those who are in the former category, who see threats and vulnerabilities in the same way, will be welcome in the supply chains that originate or end on US shores. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope this has been useful. Please send your questions to KOSTI and I will attempt to answer them as efficiently as possible.